So that question again, whether we should own an airline that's not making any money, that's projected to make even bigger losses than it is currently, talking about hiking prices, potentially cutting routes. Here are the hikes from yesterday. Domestic flight will cost you an extra $10, they reckon, on average. A short haul, an extra $20, and if you're going long haul international, an extra $90 a ticket. This is because of the war in Iran and what's happened to the price of jet fuel that we just spoke about with Dileepa. The national carrier, remember we own half of it, says this won't be the end of that either, and here's why. This is the price. Shot up almost 60% to 157 US dollars a barrel. They have also, Air New Zealand, suspended their earnings guidance for the rest of the financial year, meaning their projected losses are likely to be even worse than what they had told us. Here's the stock market reaction, falling, as you can see here, 13% in the last 5 days. Now, we've asked Air New Zealand's boss onto the program. So far, it's a no, but we live in hope. Earlier on the show, we were looking at the future of Air New Zealand. I've just spoken to Simeon, the State-Owned Enterprises Minister, so we'll ask him about that. But I started with health and COVID, and that report yesterday said that we need a pandemic plan. You might remember, before COVID, we did have a pandemic plan. When COVID came along, we threw it out the window. So what's to make us think that next time would be any different?
Well, look, the report has a range of recommendations which we're going to consider as a government and respond to in July. But the reality is that ultimately decisions at the end of the day do get made by ministers. What this report identifies is what those decisions, those key decisions were. And we have this report now because this government did put a phase 2 inquiry in place to look at those big calls which had a big impact on New Zealanders, whether that's the lockdowns, the mandates, the economic impact of COVID. And what this report says, we need to make sure we balance those economic impacts with the health response in order to get through things such as a pandemic. And also says very clearly the best thing we can do to prepare for the next pandemic is to make sure we have a strong economy and that we're focused on growing the economy so that we are actually able to, whether it's economic shocks, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's a pandemic, the best thing we can do as a country is be prepared is to focus on growing our economy.
All right.
And that economic buffer that we need.
It's not exactly a smoking gun for Labor, though, is it? I mean, tell me something in this report that really points the finger at Hipkins that the other report didn't.
Well, I think what it shows, firstly, this report looks at some of those big calls which the previous government didn't actually want the Royal Commission asking questions about.
Yeah, but it's done that, and it's found basically it was all good, apart from we could have done a few things a bit better.
Well, I think it highlights a number of areas where, Chris Hipkins was getting up here on the podium of truth and saying that he was following health advice. Well, on a number of instances, he wasn't. And New Zealanders, when we're facing the consequences of these lockdowns, particularly Aucklanders, actually deserve transparency and accountability. And I think that's what this report does. It has lessons to be learnt. It's incumbent upon politicians and decision makers to make sure those lessons are learnt. And that's what this government's going to be doing now as we go through the recommendations and as we respond to this in July later this year.
All right. I know Nicola Willis is the shareholding minister, but you're the SOE minister. Air New Zealand, how bad is the situation?
Well, look, I think we've seen in terms of the fuel prices globally, oil prices have gone up significantly. They've now come down significantly. They're still higher than what they were 2 weeks ago prior to the strikes in Iran. The reality is there's huge volatility in these markets, and this will put pressure on Air New Zealand. That ultimately, we want to make sure that, as a government, we're doing everything we can to be able to respond. That's why Nicola Willis has put in place a ministerial group looking at how we do respond and to be seeing if there are things the government can do to soften the impacts here in New Zealand, looking at what those are.
Including a cash injection for Air New Zealand, would you consider that?
Oh, look, that's not something I think the minister's considering at this stage. I think the reality is Air New Zealand has to weather the storm.
On their own.
And work through this.
Figure it out.
The reality here.
Why do we own them, Minister? Why do we own them? They're not making money. They're looking at cutting routes. They're putting up prices. Why bother owning them?
Well, we've committed as a government this term that we're not in the business of selling assets the government owns. What we are focused is making sure they perform. This is one that has had a very challenging few years in terms of airplanes, engines, and obviously commodity prices. But our expectation very clearly is that they focus on doing the basics well, running their business on time, and delivering a service that New Zealanders actually want to have and can be proud of. They've got a lot of work to do. We expect
Fair enough.
that.
So your message is we are not, National will not sell our stake in Air New Zealand, not this term, not next term, not ever.
Well, look, we've said we're not selling assets this term.
Right, what about next term? What about this term?
Any policy, and we haven't announced any policy around, election policy around that for if there would be one. We haven't, but the point is we're focused on.
But it's that's a pretty massive
commitment. We're not selling any assets this term.
Yeah, I know, but next term. I mean, does what's happening to Air New Zealand right now change the equation for you? Does it make you start to consider this as one of the live options for post-election?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's talked about asset recycling in the opportunity in that area, but ultimately,
is this an opportunity?
Well, we've said we're not selling assets this term. This term of government, we have a coalition agreement with New Zealand First that we won't do that. What we want to see is our state-owned enterprises focused on improved performance, and there have been significant challenges for New Zealand they've had to work through with planes, with engines, with having to the recovery from the restrictions.
It's well documented stuff.
A huge amount of work to do.
When will we know from you?
Work through that and focus on the basics.
When will we know from you whether you do want to sell our stake in Air New Zealand or not? As the Minister for State Enterprises, I can only talk to what is the government policy, which is that we're not selling state-owned enterprises during this term of government. But our expectation that Air New Zealand works through these issues that they're facing, and
that they're very focused.
Nationals policy we'll find out at the election, I suppose. Hey, very quickly, this is on fees. A lot of the regional, I spoke to Dwayne Emeny from Chatham's this morning. A lot of those regional airlines are talking about the CAA fees. I know as Transport Minister you hiked them. Should they have been hiked? Should they come down? I mean, they're feeling a lot of pressure at the moment.
Well, one of the things, I'm not the Minister for Transport anymore, but one of the things that I know James Meagher, Associate Minister for Transport Responsible Aviation, is doing is working very closely with those smaller airlines and looking at what can be done to provide support to ensure that those routes and that connectivity is able to be there. That's an important focus of the Associate Minister of Transport, James Meagher. Those regional airlines do play a really important role, and he's working very closely with them to see what role the government can do to support them.